Conversations. My name is Benjamin J Butler. I'm founder of the Emerging Future Institute. This is a weekly show talking about topical issues as they emerge and then how they might relate to the bigger future. We've had a big week. Today we have the Federal Reserve meeting that probably raise interest rates. The economy is quite hot in the United States at the moment, but the underlying, financial system has huge issues, and we'll be touching on that in future weeks. Yesterday in the British Parliament, Theresa May managed to get her own way, but it's a very tenuous position in the United Kingdom at the moment. Ultimately, in 10-20 years' time, I expect the EU to have broken down. And new collaborations would have emerged. The United Kingdom might be part of some bigger federation, if that's the way we go, with countries like Canada, US, Australasia. But these are conversations for another time. Today, what seems important to me is the events unfolding on the Korean Peninsula. Very important to me in my personal life. I have a home not too far from the headquarters of the Korean military near Daejeon, and I float between Korea, London, Hong Kong, and my in-laws are Korean, and I have a half Korean daughter. So very much a vested interest in a peaceful outcome. We've been saying that for 3-4 years now that something would happen, there would be a big breakthrough, most likely through peace, not war. And there's been a few hairy moments along the way, but there were bigger tectonic forces at work. I don't believe the North Koreans didn't want peace. I think that everything is not what it seems, and there's a lot going on with international diplomacy that we don't hear about. The falling out between North Korea and China could have been because of their missile system, but there were also rumours about Kim's uncle going to Hu Jintao asking whether he could be sanctioned to essentially assassinate and take over from Kim Jong-un, and that's why he had him executed. There's lots going on. I've heard over the years many times that just like the Iranians, that the North Koreans actually did want a deal with the Americans, but they wanted to meet the president. They wanted to go and get a deal. So when all the experts said nothing could be done, it was one of these situations on the planet that was impossible to resolve. I just wondered whether it was like Henry Ford's quip: if you want to know how something can't be done, go and meet a whole bunch of experts. But perhaps I'm being a little bit unfair. But Singapore, I thought was a big breakthrough. Trump meeting the Chairman Kim was a big thing, and Trump signed off on the Panmunjom Declaration. So the newspapers are full of rhetoric that Trump gave away too much. Trump lost, Kim got an A+ and won the summit, but presumably in a time of peace, there's no winner or loser, and I think that the great winners of all of this are the 70-odd million people in the Korean Peninsula, and the rest of the region, and I dare say America. I didn't really think that the North Koreans would ever be so dumb to attack the United States, but there were people that feared that. So I saw quite a few big concessions from the North Koreans. The Panmunjom Declaration did say they were moving and promised to denuclearize the entire peninsula, and in the meantime Kim would make a number of gestures. In fact, a number of important gestures were made before the summit. So it seems to be that in their hatred of Donald Trump, it might be clouding some of the journalists' judgment. Of course, some of the questions at the Q&A were legitimate, but I found that the bias, 99% of the questions were a little bit sceptical and pessimistic. Not once did a journalist put up his or her hand and say, well, Mr. President, what do you think the peninsula could look like in 20, 30 years' time? So that would be really interesting to me. That's the kind of conversation I want to have. To me, the symbolism was important, and as was the symbolism of the April meeting between Moon Jae-in of South Korea and Chairman Kim. I think you could see I looked at the body language, and these were two Koreans. They spoke the same language. The gesticulations was kind of similar. So even though these countries have been divided for 70 odd years, I think it's a bit extreme to say they're completely different. You know, they've got thousands of years of common culture, civilization. They have a history of Buddhism, Confucianism. There's a whole heritage. So that's what they need to focus on. So today I interviewed two people in Seoul, Emmanuel Pastriche and Lakvinder Sin, both interested in policy and both having lived in on the peninsula for decades. And I think their reactions are quite intriguing. So lastly, the G7, that on the surface looked like a mess. I think, and Trump was criticised for treating Chairman Kim incredibly well whilst attacking Trudeau of Canada. It's I think Trump is going through a messy process at the moment. It looks like he's trying to destroy Western civilization if you're wearing a certain pair of spectacles. The other way of looking at this is that he was given a mandate to put American interests first, and there's been a whole demographic of Americans that have been economically suffering in recent years, and so from an economics perspective, America's been the buyer of last resort around the world, and Germany, Japan, China, many nations have built their business models on exporting to the Americans, and this is not sustainable. And so Trump's mandate really is to renegotiate that, and also through the trade treaties, and also cut costs in many different ways. If America's going to, I guess, put America first and go back to the original Constitution, which the Founding Fathers didn't want American troops to be embroiled in foreign wars, then maybe there's many different ways he can cut the budget. And one of the comments that has been made is how much the Americans pay in the NATO budgets and various other super international bodies. So it's going to be an ugly process, but I think everyone at the table understands this. But anyway, I'm not going to dwell on the G7 this week. We can talk a bit more about that next week. I think we've just had a major victory on the Korean Peninsula, and let's hope that exogenous forces don't put a spanner in the works, as they say. But so far so good. And now you can see 2 interviews I did.
Futurist. Today I'm joined by Lakvinder Singh, who is director of the Asia Institute, has been a long-term resident of South Korea. And I believe you are also a South Korean citizen, is that right?
No, I have PR. My wife is a citizen.
Your wife is a citizen and you've got PR, right? Great. I know you've been working quite a lot in the community and trying to bring strengthen relations between India and South Korea. So I know you've been doing some great work. What do you as someone that is very involved in South Korea, and what were your first impressions of the Singapore summit yesterday?
My first impression is quite good. I'm positive. I think something has really happened, which has never happened before. So I'm positive. Overall, even though I'm a little bit concerned about some specifics, but as a whole, I'm positive. I'm feeling good.
Great. Do you think the press? I don't know if you watched the entire Q&A with President Trump, but
I watched it.
Yeah. What was your impression of that? I mean, a lot of the journalists were focused on it felt like they were focused on what could go wrong. What about this? What about that? I saw very few questions about real possibilities.
Yes. Press was not helping. Press was very negative and just focusing on human rights, and they were trying to give an impression that we are giving too much to North Korea and we are not getting anything back. So I think Trump did very well. He fought back and he's able to convey his viewpoint. So he was in the end he felt he did something. I felt something. He was good.
Is it? I mean, for me, having family in South Korea, it's been quite an emotional year, and watching the two presidents of North South Korea coming together, and then again yesterday. Do you feel emotional about these developments?
Yes, as you know, I'm a president of Korea Peace Movement, so we have a lot of members of our movement in Korea. So we are emotionally attached with this issue. We organize seminar, conference, events. So I'm deeply involved with this peace movement. So it was very emotional movement for us also. So and we are trying to see the positives of the event yesterday. So we are not going to negative, even though we are concerned. We have our issues and our concerns, but we think what happened is really good and it should be taken to its logical conclusion. So we don't have bad feeling about it. We have a positive feeling about it. So yes, we have emotional attachment with the issue.
And what let's focus on the positives first. So can you imagine what a future even reunified Korea might look like in 10, 20 years' time?
Yes, positive unification Korea will be very good, very rich, prosperous, and self-dependent, and strong enough to face China. So a lot of things will be getting, like family problem, this is increasing poverty problem, population problem will get solved. South Korea is heading towards a very serious economic and social crisis. But if unification occur, a lot of South Korea's current problem will automatically solve, like population problem, economic growth problem, nuclear problem, and aging poverty, and a lot of other issues. So that is very positively. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
So what do you think before we talk about any of the challenges that we're going to face in this process, what do you think what's the low-hanging fruit? If you were a leader involved in this process, what are the easy things that North South Korea can do at this stage to bring themselves closer together?
low hanging will be, I think low hanging fruit will be the tensions, the tension which we are thinking we will be having nuclear war tomorrow, that tension will go away and some kind of stability, some kind of peace will come. So low hanging fruit like hugging, kissing, that is low, that is a low hanging fruit which we can achieve very easily and which can be done very easily. So, and its effect will be quite good. Like tension will be gone, psychological pressure will be gone, Yes.
Mm, mm. And then what other positive things could you see develop? Do you think the Korean Railway is going to be something that they'll address early on in the process?
Yeah, that is what they're aiming at. But once they start actually doing it on the ground, I think there will be a lot of issues. It's not that easy. From where the money will come, from what kind of, even if they build the land, for what purpose it will be used. Something is related. Everything is connected. You can make that visible line, but how to make it operational? What kind of things? What kind of goods we can exchange, use it for what? Like that kind of specific issues will come into play. It's not that easy that you make a railway line and then you don't know who can travel, when they can travel, what kind of things, what kind of goods you can carry. Because North Korea is under sanctions. It's not that easy. So even though on the paper it looks very good, but when they start implementing it, a lot of issues will come. So nuclear problem and sanctions issue has to be solved first. You cannot have a railway line, then don't use it for nothing, And if people cannot travel, if people cannot go to Punjab, North Korea without visa or without any permission, what is the use of railway? Just an empty railway line, nobody is there to use, So we have to go to specifics. So low hanging fruit is that you can make the railway line, but the high hanging fruit will be who can use it and for what purposes we can use it, So until and unless we solve this nuclear problem, ultimately it will be not good use. Yes, that's what I think.
Okay, I'm joined now by Emmanuel Pastriche, my friend in Seoul, who's founder of the Asia Institute. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure, always.
Thank you for your time today. It's such I think, an important moment of human history. I've been really emotional this year.
Very true, very true.
So it sounds like you're optimistic. What's your first take on Singapore?
Oh, well, I don't know if optimism is entirely the right term. I'm optimistic in the sense that there is an enormous opportunity before us, but it's not. If we leave it in the hands of self-indulgent politicians, it can easily slip away as well. So the real question is whether we, yourself, myself, and all those joining us around the world can seize the opportunity, can rally ourselves to put forth a new vision for what the world can be, starting here, of course, in the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia, where there's the most complex, involved tensions and contradictions. And we're struggling to find some sort of a new order that would actually work to resolve all these lingering Cold War thinking, institutional structures and biases, and come up with something new or something old.
Yeah, I like the sound of that. We'll return to that theme for sure. Just sticking with Singapore, did you feel the press conference was a little bit too negative? Like, not one journalist put up his hand and said, "Mr. President, what's your vision of what the peninsula could look like in 20 years' time?" I'd be dying to ask that question. Everything was, I don't know, everything seemed to be whining about everything that could go wrong and the etiquette of treating Kim like a world leader. What was your take?
Oh, well, I mean, I didn't really like the format of the discussion, and I thought the questions of the journalists were totally off. It seemed almost like they were lingering in some now vanished Cold War world. That's not to say that I think that Donald Trump was a political genius or that he's doing the right thing in every respect, but it struck me as sort of tragic almost that nobody was questioning him or pushing him on the really important questions, which is what sort of a order are we going to create? How are we going to go forward? How can we, the underlying assumption in many of those questions was that North Korea is inherently different than any other country in the world, inherently a threat, and it's inhabited by these hybrid humans who think and act differently than the rest of us. I simply don't accept that assumption, right? I assume that North Koreans, like South Koreans, like British, or even, God forbid, Americans, are made up of a mixture of good and bad and everything in between. And given the right opportunities and the right sort of vision, are totally capable of rising to the opportunity, to the occasion.
Well said. Well said. I've had conversations recently, as I'm sure you have, with people that work for NGOs or in various capacities have gone into North Korea, and surprise, surprise, they report back North Korea is full of human beings who...
It's amazing. It truly is.
So one reason I reached out to you on this at this time was I really enjoyed your article where you said, perhaps rather than just talking about investment opportunities, business, geopolitics, etc., which is all important, for the Korean people themselves, to bring the two countries together, they need to focus on their common culture. And
right.
I've been saying to friends who ask me about the situation and clients that the last 70 years was an aberration, and you have thousands
Absolutely.
of years of common history. What's your stance on it, and what are the things we could look at to bring the two nations together?
Right. So actually, when I get into this discussion, I try and avoid the word culture, because people think about going for a walk in the park and going to the art museum to look at paintings. I think but it is within that larger mansion. But what we're really talking about is, how was Korea run over the last, say, 2,000, 3,000 years? What were the institutions? Governance, relationship of local government and central government, long-term planning, city planning, agriculture, education systems, a whole range. And of course, they were different. It wasn't monolithic. Each from Shilla, Paekje, and Goryeo, all the way up to Chosun and beyond, they had their own traditions, their own habits, and own best practices. So for me, I'll confess in advance that I'm an American, and so I tended to see it in the American perspective, which was the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And at that moment, a small group of inspired men, not all angels, but thoughtful men, came together, and they thought, we have this opportunity to develop it, to create a new country, but we're not going to do some 2001 Blade Runner imagining the future, but rather we're going to go back and look at the best of past institutions, specifically Greece, but also Rome, and see what aspects of that tradition we can take and reinterpret to create some new system of government. That's, of course, a development on the previous precedent of the Renaissance, basically from the 15th, 16th century, in which a similar move was made to say European culture is stagnant, it lacks the necessary sort of cultural power to drive forward. Let's go back to the past, Greece and Rome, of course, in that case as well. But it's not a reactionary seeking out of some lost glory of the past, but rather using aspects of those traditions to create something, in the case of the Renaissance, which was totally unprecedented. It wasn't a return to Greece and Rome. It was rather finding inspiration for something new. And that's true for the United States. So let's shift back to the Korean Peninsula. So we have piles of problems. North Korea, South Korea, problems everywhere. But as Peter Drucker, the great management guru, said, don't solve problems. Look for new opportunities, i.e., find these new potentials in the past of how Korea was governed, how it was administered, how it was planned, how it was educated. Find aspects of those and turn them into opportunities for the future. And once you start to move towards those new opportunities, new possibilities, then the thousands of complexities and contradictions and problems of Korean society will naturally be resolved in that process.
Yeah, very, very wise words. What struck me at the Moon Kim summit as well was,
which was the more significant one, I would say, in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, both obviously very important, but
in my opinion.
Sure. And I think you noted in your article something about the symbology of that event and the fact the guards were wearing the costumes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, well, so it was a very significant point in which they have the military, which of course is the core political entity in any country, or in most countries. And so the question was, would they have an honor guard? I mean, I wasn't there for the discussions, but we can interpolate what it probably was. And the solution they came up was to have an honor guard for both the leaders of North and South Korea dressed in the uniforms of the Chosun period, say 18th century, more or less. And that was, I think, a brilliant solution. And it suggested some of that potentiality to say, if we're trying to resolve these two systems of governance, these culture ideologies, that rather than go through this impossible task of trying to match them up or import one into the other or whatever, one take over the other, that we should rather go back to the past and reaffirm some of the best of Korea's traditions, and in that process, create something which is new, right? It's not a reactionary, just like the Renaissance, or for that matter, the Constitution of the United States. It's not a reactionary movement going back to the past, but rather it's saying, in that past, we see enormous potentiality.
It's funny, like the press keep saying things like enough promises haven't been extracted enough, and the process so far has been too full of symbols and gestures. But I actually think symbols actually are incredibly important.
Incredibly important, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's my hope. I mean, in my opinion, the Moon-Kim meeting was probably the more significant one. The Trump-Kim meeting was necessary in order to make it go forward. But I think the next step will be for Koreans, and North and South, to come together and do some concrete discussion about what Korea can be. And that conversation, I believe, is possible. And in a way, although it's the deeper discussion, in a way it's the easier one, right? If you have some vision that we're going to create a greater Korea, drawing on the best of its tradition over the last 2,000 years. And by the way, that doesn't rule out best practices from Kim Il-sung or Lee Seung-man or Park Chung-hee, right? As long as you see that not as an endorsement of any of those three regimes, but rather saying that within those regimes, just like the Chosun, which I don't want to live in Chosun Korea myself, but that doesn't keep me from being able to, doesn't keep us from recognizing that there were systems of good governance, of sustainable agriculture, of all of education systems, which had tremendous amount to offer. Chosun education didn't, for the most part, didn't offer high-level education to women. So does that mean we should just throw it all in the trash? I don't think so. I mean, the Greeks had slaves, and their whole democratic system was based upon many assumptions which I find quite offensive. But in fact, we have seen in the United States and in around the world, in Europe, a slow process by which that concept of democratic participation was expanded from propertied white ruling class men to people without property, men, to people of other races, to women, and has expanded and developed, in which that potentiality within a rather reactionary and not particularly open society of ancient Greece could be explored and expanded into something truly remarkable.
Well, I'm excited as well, and I love your enthusiasm. I think you're doing some really important work there, and like you say, when it comes to the future, I believe in democratizing the future. We all need to get involved.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, bad interests don't hijack the whole thing. So keep up the good work, and thank you so much for joining future conversations today.
Excellent. Look forward to seeing you again soon.